The Bill and Melinda Gates Medical Research Institute, well known as it may be, does not get a ton of ink in the biotech business trades, in part because there's no trading going on. Gates MRI is a nonprofit biotech launched in 2018 and funded by the Gates Foundation. As such, there's no dramatic story of a hard-fought and oversubscribed Series A. During COVID times, there's no plans to IPO in a bear market. There's no clawing its way back from the brink of bankruptcy. But the things that Gates MRI does have in spades, and the things that more traditional public and private biotech companies can learn from it, are many. It's got drug development partnership deals with companies like GSK, Merck, Novavax, and others. It's got an all-star leadership team. Astute listeners will remember that Gates MRI head of CMC, Dr. Piper Trelstad, joined me on episode 132 of the podcast. And Bioprocess Online followers might recall my recent profile of the juggernaut chief operating officer, Deborah Weiss. Perhaps most importantly, Gates MRI has a carefully curated pipeline of candidates, custom built to address unmet medical needs, primarily affecting women and children in underprivileged parts of the world. And those candidates are moving fast. Its B. infantis candidate is in phase 3. Its tuberculosis vaccine just entered phase 3. And it's got 4 or 5 additional clinical programs at various stages in Shigella, tuberculosis, and malaria, and a handful of preclinical programs beyond that. Central to the global humanitarian mission at Gates MRI are its people, many of whom have more than just hands-on in the lab experience, developing new medicines, but also boots on the ground experience, building the life sciences industries in underserved parts of the world. I'm Matt Pillar. This is The Business of Biotech, and my guest on today's show is exemplary of that persona. She is Dr. Claire Wagner, head of corporate strategy and market access at Gates MRI. And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to get to know her. We're going to get to know her work and the broader impact of Gates MRI in the business of biotech. Dr. Wagner, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here. And thank you for a very kind and generous introduction. It's really lovely to be part of your show.
It's super lovely for you to be part of our show. I was excited at the opportunity to have you on the show and talk with you, in large part because of your super rich experiences, even prior to coming to Gates MRI. And I want to start there. I want to start by sort of getting a sense of who Dr. Claire Wagner is. And I'm going to give our listeners just a little bit of background on you to set that conversation up. You followed up your Dartmouth undergrad in anthropology with a Harvard Medical School MD and an MBA. And when I look at that mix and I think about the current position that you're in at Gates MRI and the Gates mission, it seems like that was a carefully curated foundation for the role that you play today. I'm sure it wasn't, though, because there were a lot of stops along the way that we're going to learn about today. But if you take us back to that time, like coming out of Dartmouth, going to med school, and kind of thinking about what you wanted to do professionally, what were your intentions? I mean, assuming that you weren't carefully curating this role prior to Gates MRI even being a thing.
No, I think that's right, Matt. There is, as with many people's careers, maybe everybody's careers, it's really quite nonlinear. And I would say a lot of the decisions that I ended up being able and having the privilege to make from a career standpoint and an education standpoint came from some luck and the identification and seizure of that luck. And so seizing of that luck. And so I after college, I had the incredible opportunity to take a role working in Rwanda. It was supposed to be a 10-month role. It ended up being a 3-year full-time in Kigali role, a couple years after that, back and forth. And as my now late mentor, Paul Farmer, used to say, there is no post-Rwanda. There is no time in your life where you won't be connected to this place that will give you so much. And that was really true from my experience there. And the 5 years I spent doing work in Rwanda and with colleagues in the global health space after college, those were the years and the experiences that ultimately drove me to pursue medicine and then later to pursue business. And I actually had, as you said, there wasn't much strategy to it. I did not have an intention to be in this role. Certainly, this organization didn't exist. I hadn't even done pre-medical training. So part of going to med school for me meant going back and doing physics and chemistry and organic chemistry and biology, the classes you usually take when you're 18, 19. I was a decade beyond that, and I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to go back and do those studies and pursue the advanced degrees that I then was able to do in service of the values that were instilled in me during my experiences in Rwanda.
Yeah, take us. So we're going to get into that, and I've got some questions for you about Dr. Farmer. I've read up on him and watched some of his interviews on YouTube, and I've formed an opinion of the man. I want to ask you about yours before I offer mine. But before we get to that, the opportunity to go to Rwanda, how did it present itself, and why was this even a thing on your radar? Why was it an option? Like, if, my kids are doing amazing things. I've got a 20-year-old and an 18-year-old. I've got a 20-year-old son. If someone came up to him and said, "Hey, I have an opportunity for you. You can go to Rwanda for 10 months." He'd be like, "Yeah, that's really not on my bingo card." So what at the time, why was that an appealing move for you?
I suppose some of it was part of growing up in a very international home where my parents, that was part of my childhood, was being at the dinner table surrounded by colleagues and friends of theirs from all over the world. My dad does international education work, was in the Peace Corps in Morocco in the 60s, still works in Morocco to this day. And so I had a lot of exposure to global oriented things from an early stage, and ultimately realized that and as I went through my studies and then in college, knew that I wanted to make a contribution to global issues in some way, shape, or form. And it was during college that I was exposed to what is called, or has later been sort of called, global health, which is really a catch-all phrase and maybe doesn't describe the field perfectly, but those were some opportunities that I had while I was in school to work and do research I did research in Tanzania and also did some work in Mali when I was an undergraduate, and knew that I was interested in being part of global health efforts, broadly speaking. And then a very fortuitous thing happened, and the president of Dartmouth College in my senior year became Jim Kim. He was hired to be the new president. And he had founded Partners in Health with Paul Farmer and Ophelia Dahl. And so suddenly there was this influx of global health enthusiasm and excitement on campus. And it was through Jim, who became a mentor to me and still is a mentor to me, that I had the opportunity to meet Paul and meet who would be the future Minister of Health of Rwanda, Dr. Agnes Binagwaho, and be aware of and then apply for the opportunity to go work for Dr. Agnes and Paul in Rwanda. So that's really the kind of long story of how I came to be aware of that opportunity. But it was a one-line job description. So I didn't know exactly what I was going to be doing. And
give us the Cliff's notes. I mean, you don't need the Cliff's notes on a one-line job description, but what do you remember the exact line? What was the line?
I remember the moment I opened the email and all of the rest. There's an opportunity to be the research assistant to Dr. Agnes Binagwaho in Kigali, full-time in Kigali, Rwanda, period.
And you're like, yeah.
I said, yeah. I had applied to a bunch of other jobs, rescinded my applications, and couple months later, I was on a plane to Kigali.
So the Dr. Farmer connection was established with Dartmouth. Did you know at the time that the Dr. Farmer was kind of a big deal?
Yeah, it was right around the time, or must have been after, but there there was a book written about him, and he was a legend already then, in my head, and in many people's heads. He was
Wait,
a
let me interrupt you real quick because I also happen to know that he too was an anthropologist
yeah, yes.
turned medicine maker. Were you aware of this? Like, was this alignment part of your calculus?
Oh, there was no calculus, but it was definitely the inspiration and drive, and I thought I thought the world of him, think the world of him. And I also was really curious through the experiences that I had as a kid about international education through my dad, about global issues through coursework I had the opportunity to take on, and really knew that I wanted to contribute in that way. And so having the opportunity to learn through the lens of anthropology made a lot of sense to me. It just clicked for me that approaching a an opportunity to contribute with the lens of curiosity, engagement, respect. Those are all part of the kind of tools that you learn when you're studying anthropology, how to ask questions in certain ways or others, how to engage in a community in certain ways or others, how to be respectful of cultures, and how to embed yourself in a new environment that might be unfamiliar to you. And I got a lot out of that kind of mindset and training, and so it just clicked. I mean, it was certainly the inspiration of Paul and Jim having done that. And it also was how I was brought up. I think it worked. It worked in my mind. My mom is a psychologist, and my dad is in international education, and anthropology is a good mix of um, is a good way to approach learning in a global environment.
Yeah. So tell us, and I feel bad for our listeners because if you're not familiar with the work of Dr. Paul Farmer, we're about to make you, albeit briefly, familiar with who he is and what he did. So I want two perspectives from you, Dr. Wagner, on Paul. One, just share with our audience who he was from a professional sort of standpoint, and then two, I'd like you to share a little bit about who he was to you on a professional and personal level.
So we could spend an hour talking about all the
Well,
professional
yeah, and
things
I'll
about Paul, but
interrupt you.
I'll
Yeah,
give the
I'll
quick
interrupt you again real quick. We'll
yeah,
give you the Cliffs Notes for real this
yeah,
time.
yeah,
Just hit YouTube. I mean, there's so much fascinating content featuring
yeah, yeah,
Dr. Farmer and his work. So
yeah, yeah. So Paul co-founded, as I mentioned, Partners in Health with Ophelia Dahl and Jim Kim in 1987. Partners in Health has then become a very major global health organization around the world with sister organizations in many countries around the world. And in addition to that work that Paul did, he taught for many, many years in the Harvard Medical School community, courses in global health, medical anthropology, and so forth. And I think there are a lot of pioneering there was a lot of pioneering work that he did, and a huge number of changes that he ushered along and fought for in the global health community that we can look back and say, yes, that was Paul. That was Paul's work. In addition to the innumerable ways that he changed the global health landscape and global health architecture, he also brought up many, many people. And I am a very fortunate one of those many, many, many people who he took under his wing. And he made every mentee that he had feel like they were the only mentee of his.
It's
And
incredible.
it was a remarkable thing. And I feel very fortunate to have been mentored by him for the years that I was.
He this guy had access. Like I mean, he had access into the upper reaches of important people in global health. And yet, like, I get that sense. I was going to say I wanted your perspective, and then I was going to share just, I mean, mine from a million miles away. I think those YouTube videos I reference are a great example. Go check them out. Like, you get the sense that this guy's presence, like his presence with you, with the person who's asking him questions, with the person he's working with, is uncommon. Like, it's uncommon for a person to have that kind of presence and engagement, right? In a meaningful way with the person that they're speaking with. And I get the sense that, like, he took that with him wherever he went. I mean, and it didn't matter what color the person was that he was working with. It didn't matter what language they spoke. He was engaged for humanity.
He was. And, on our badges here at Gates MRI, we have the phrase, all lives have equal value. And he lived that every day. He would spend the same amount of deep quality conversation time with the head of the WHO as he would with the person who was in charge of sanitation in one of the hospitals that he helped found. He knew the names of all the patients on the ward. It was just incredible. When I would round on patients with him in Rwanda, which wasn't often, he knew every patient's name, every patient's parent's name who was there with them. He just had this way about him, just like you said, of being so deeply connected and embedded in the community that he was in, and having the presence with each individual in a way that I think is quite unusual.
Yeah. So how did that sort of inform you? You said you went into it with international and cultural curiosity. How did that experience kind of form up your next steps? I mean, I'm assuming you kind of doubled down, right? Like, how did that experience kind of inform what you did next? And we'll talk about those positions that you took between then and Gates MRI.
Yeah. So much of my time in Rwanda was working with Paul. Also, much of my time in Rwanda was working with the Minister of Health, Dr. Agnes Binagwaho, who we could spend a whole nother podcast talking about her career and the pioneering work that she did and all that I learned from her. And I have a colleague who says every day with her was like getting a master's degree, and I would stand by that. And the changes that she made to the global health architecture are also too numerous to count. And she and Paul were thick as thieves in doing the work that they did. And so one of the things, though, during those years that I was there, I did have the opportunity to on my personal time, shadow in a public referral hospital in Kigali. That gave me a lens that was quite different from working in the public sector at the level of policymaking and product introduction. Here I was in a pediatric unit, specifically shadowing physicians who were taking care of kids who had heart disease and cancer. And what I observed at the time there was a setting that some described as being like HIV was 20 years before, 10 or 20 years before, where patients go to this ward, a pediatric cardiology ward, basically to die. There was no solution. There were no oncology products being procured in the public referral hospital at that time. And so I witnessed through the patients that we rounded on, unfortunately, many of whom did pass away during that time, and watched as the physicians tried to pool their funds to source drugs on the private market to try to treat these kids with cancer, for example, that there was this gap between technology and products and people who needed them.
Mm.
It is pretty obvious, right? It's not a big, profound realization, but the fact that that gap felt so, this is not really a word, but unapproximatable, right? You couldn't, it was very difficult, almost intractable to approximate those to the product with the patient in those settings.
Mm.
I got really curious about that, and I applied to medical school because of that, and I applied to business school because of that, because I am driven by this idea that it doesn't have to be that way. That the products are out there, the money is out there, the people are out there, and the patients are out there. And if we can get the right kind of architecture set up between all of those stakeholders and resources, we can make a big difference. And that is why I set out on the journey to go back and do all of the schooling. And then ultimately what led me to Gates MRI, because of the mission that we have here to develop products for diseases that have a tremendous burden in low-income settings, low and middle-income settings, and the opportunity to build out how we're going to ensure access, affordability, equitable distribution of the products that we develop in those marketplaces. That is what makes me excited every day to go to work.
Yeah. With your credentials, your experiences, your background, you could. I'm just going to pose. I'm going to pose the question like this: you could have very likely taken a position with any number of pharmaceutical, biopharmaceutical, even biotech companies that profess the mission toward the democratization of medicine. There are a lot of them. There are a lot of companies out there that are, we want to make them more affordable, more distributable, more equitable. We want to democratize access. Why Gates MRI?
Well, first up, so Gates MRI, we are a 6-year-old organization, 6+-year-old organization, and we get to be at this intersection of big global health problem and commercial approaches to solving that problem without the need for a return on investment. So that means that we have the privilege, it's really a privilege, to make certain decisions on access, on addressing target, or on creating target product profiles, on addressing different characteristics that the WHO will look for a policy recommendation, for example, that other entities may have more constraints on. We don't have shareholders per se that we're answering to in quarterly earnings calls. We have a very different set of metrics that we are accountable for, and those have to do with developing products that are aligned with major global health disease burdens and that can be accessible in the marketplaces that we serve. I do think, though, that I'm glad there's competition. I hope there's competition. One of the great outcomes of the Gates MRI as let's call it an experiment of the Gates Foundation to found us 6+ years ago, would be that there's more Gates MRIs. That would be a great outcome, in my view. And having other biotechs and pharmaceutical companies take on roles in the global health ecosystem through their charitable foundations or through their commercial branches of in their global health groups. And we work with some of those groups, and they're fantastic. And I think it's the more the merrier. And even Paul would say that, right? More people around the table,
Yeah.
To do this work. And another element of our business model that I think is another privilege that we have is this opportunity to collaborate. Our ability to work through and with and in partnership with both commercial partners, philanthropic partners, and downstream partners that will help us ensure access to our products in low and middle income markets. That's another element that really drew me into this organization and is a big part of what we do at Gates MRI.